This is a follow-up on my previous video discussing the use of DRM in the Steam ports of the Resident Evil trilogy developed by GOG. But that video has a glaring problem that most DRM-related videos do. It doesn't really explain what DRM is and how it works, and I think that's causing a lot of confusion. I made the video with the assumption we all know what DRM is and how it works, but judging by the comments I received from both pro and anti-DRM people, that statement is not true. DRM, aka Digital Rights Management, is a form of technology used by game developers to manage their copyrighted material and how it's used. It serves two main purposes: preventing piracy and preventing the misuse of copyrighted material. The most notable example of misusing said copyrighted material being mods, which Capcom have been very vocally against, mostly due to the Chun-Li incident with the Street Fighter games, in which during a public tournament for one of the games, a player entered the competition with a, let's just say, expressive alternative skin for one of the characters. Since then, most of their games have contained some form of DRM, and they even went out of their way to add it to much older titles that they are on record for not really caring about anymore. Nintendo, as you all probably are very well aware, has very similar policies regarding mods. This was the whole issue with Garry's Mod a few years ago, in which the gaming giant demanded any and all Nintendo IPs on the Steam Workshop to be removed for the sandbox game Garry's Mod. Which, if you've played Garry's Mod, or you can even read the title of it, you would know that's probably a big deal since the game is entirely supported by mods. Now, how DRM actually works. DRM is a very broad term and does cover many things, so I will try to simplify it as much as I can. On console, it's a little bit more straightforward with disc-based content because features like the PlayStation 1, usually the wobble on the disc, is how it would verify the game files to make sure it is a legitimate copy of the game. On PC, it's a little bit more invasive. The software essentially scans your entire computer and all its files, making sure there is no misuse of said copyrighted material, such as mods, while also essentially locking the actual game files, making sure you aren't able to rip the game and reproduce it. On the surface, this seems like a fair practice. Steam itself has been a very pro-DRM service pretty much since its inception. The problem people now have with DRM is individual publishers tacking on their own DRM with their games on PC. But the difference is that people trust Valve, which wasn't always true. People very much hated Valve and Steam when it first came out for the same exact reason. A lot of up-and-coming DRM software for these companies are pretty shady, and they border on spyware, which can affect the performance on some computers. The reason I say can is because obviously computers can be like people. They're all different, they all have different specs, they all have different setups. What affects my computer may not affect your computer. But there are many reported cases of these DRMs acting like malware and slowing your computer down. I need to emphasize this though, DRM is not malware. However, it does act like it inside your computer. And there are many cases you can go through, many Steam discussions on it, you can go through Reddit. There are tons and tons of stories about how DRM is known to slow people's computers down or cause many performance issues. Mostly with the Steam Deck has been a big concern for a lot of people as well. But the big problem is that DRM also doesn't really work very well, as most people find very easy ways around them or to mod or pirate their games, which means DRM is basically a glorified, meaningless deterrent that only harms the people who want to legitimately play their games. And performance issues aside, DRM is a very anti-consumer technology. At the root of it, it's taking the buying power away from the consumer and the customer. This is why the Xbox One completely destroyed the Xbox platform with the mandatory DRM that they had, because you were originally not going to be able to share games with friends even if they were on disc. I don't know if you guys remember that. If maybe your buddy wanted to try it out, or you simply just didn't want the game anymore, you can sell it and give it to another person, obviously. With the Xbox One, you weren't going to be able to do that, so much to the point that even Sony made fun of them for doing this.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
You see, the Xbox One had this really extreme form of DRM that basically, once you put the disc in the system, that game was now locked entirely to your account, so if your buddy put it in his Xbox, it straight up would not work. This would also essentially entirely kill the used game market as well, taking away your buying power as a consumer if you decide one day that you want to sell the game. This excessive use of DRM is precisely why there is such large backlash every single time that it's been attempted to be implemented into any sort of games, because this is exactly what people do not want to happen. And to elaborate on this further, I would actually argue that Xbox didn't entirely backpedal, they only temporarily did. I would argue that if anything, they did the opposite, because their creation of Game Pass is kind of the whole point of what they were trying to do. Obviously, the biggest controversy Xbox has kind of gotten into lately has been buying all these major studios and shutting them down, while also putting all of their games on Game Pass. I can really only imagine what the CEO of such a company would do if he bought all the farmlands in a country controlling an entire population's food supply. And going back to the anti-mod stance, which we're going to get more in depth now, it's entirely ridiculous. Modding gives games a great sense of community while also exponentially increasing their lifespans, especially for single-player games. I mean, think about games like Fallout New Vegas, which definitely wouldn't have the status they do now because of mods, and games like Stardew Valley, which have cultivated such a large modding community that really expands the game so much further beyond than what just the developers can even do due to maybe restraints or just time constraints and stuff like that. And it's even funnier too because the creator of Stardew Valley also loves the modding community and goes out of his way to make sure mods are actually working in his games. Like, Concerned Ape shoutout, like, absolutely A+ tier developer for making this entire game basically by himself. In Resident Evil's case, which was the main topic of the previous video, like I said, Capcom does not really care about the older games, and they haven't for a while. They've been on record saying this multiple times. So this was a very good opportunity to keep these games alive. And you know what keeps these older games alive? Mods, really good ones that put Capcom's work to kind of shame. The HD project for Resident Evil 4 had fans going across Europe to get the actual textures used in the game to bring this game an entire graphical console generation up. Like, the HD project mod for Resident Evil 4 is an insane feat, and if you are a fan of the game, you should definitely download it. Also, you have the Resident Evil Seamless HD mods for the original trilogy, which allowed for the easier use of mods on the classic games, while also upscaling them to an extremely nice quality. And as I previously mentioned, DRM doesn't really do a good job at preventing modding. You just now have unnecessary spyware slowing your game down and giving all your information to shady companies. Capcom's newest ports are the same ones they've been putting out for the last 20 years with no new features, yet they still expect us to buy them with said added spyware. Like, they have to realize that the bar has just been set exponentially high by not even modders, but their own company, though. Like, do they remember the ports they were even putting out, like, 10 years ago? The ports they used to put out were phenomenal. In 2015 and 16, Capcom not only remastered Resident Evil 1 and 0, but they also gave us new modes and tons of costumes and content for these games, which I would argue that the original trilogy also deserves. DMC3 on the Switch got a co-op Bloody Palace mode and a style switching mode back in 2020. DMC Devil May Cry, which obviously had a terrible launch, got a really fantastic PS4 re-release port that really fixed a lot of the issues people originally had with the game and added a ton of quality of life improvement. This was kind of what we were expecting for the original trilogy if we did ever see it come back, and while GOG did do a pretty phenomenal job at making sure these games are accessible, there was a period of time that Capcom themselves genuinely did care and were putting out phenomenal ports. Even with the original Resident Evil trilogy, the original RE1 had a phenomenal DS port with new puzzles, costumes, and unique gameplay segments just to that version. Now though, ever since the remakes have been Capcom's priority, they would really rather leave the originals to die unless they're getting a quick buck off them. Because remember, they didn't even want the GOG ports originally because they thought the remakes were suitable replacements, which is an entirely different topic, but that does show a bit of how out of touch they really are with a lot of the older fans of their franchises. They really only became interested in the GOG ports after they sold pretty well, and now they want them on Steam with this crappier DRM feature. Because yeah, I have to also emphasize that too because I didn't make that clear enough in the last video, but yes, the Steam port is the same as the GOG ports, except it has DRM features now, so I still consider them two different releases because one clearly has different features than the other. But essentially, my biggest issue with the trilogy release is the lack of care. Pretty much entirely on Capcom's part, because obviously GOG did a very good job with these ports, and Capcom, of course, just had to ruin them somehow. no any bonus content, just an extra shady DRM. And the biggest shame in this is that Steam is a phenomenal platform and very accessible to a lot of people. This was brought to my attention also in the last video as well, which I am very glad I'm getting the opportunity to talk about it again, that GOG is unfortunately not available in a lot of countries, which is what I recommended most people go to buy the game. So having access to these games is amazing on an accessibility level, and it should have been something to celebrate, not to despair, but here we are having to despair because Capcom is making really dumb decisions when it comes to handling these older titles. But look, I really don't like posting negative videos on here, and this has been a bit draining to say the least, but hopefully you now have a better understanding of DRM and the issues people have with it. Whether you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments. If you're new to the channel and saw the last 2 videos, I apologize, I have much better and more fun content, but thank you for watching, and have a good day.